what if an entire community simply vanished? No bodies, no clues, no signs of a struggle. In 1587, over 100 English settlers founded the Roanoke colony, and when help finally returned, every single one of them was gone. The only trace left behind? A single mysterious word carved into wood: CROATOAN. So what really happened on that island? Were they attacked? Did they escape? Or did something even stranger take place? In today's video, we're diving straight into one of America's oldest unsolved mysteries. Stay with me because the deeper we go, the more shocking the story becomes. Let's uncover the truth behind the lost colony of Roanoke. The story begins in 1584, when two ships set sail from England on an exploratory mission, searching for a suitable location to establish a permanent colony in the American lands. By mid-July, they reached the shores of a chain of islands known as the Outer Banks. In a short time, they managed to build friendly relations with the native tribes so strong, in fact, that the locals invited them to visit their own island, Roanoke. After nearly a month, the expedition returned to their ships to sail back to England, carrying news of what they had found. But they didn't return alone. Two native men traveled with them. One was Wanchese from Roanoke. The other was Manteo from a nearby island called CROATOAN. Their experiences in England could not have been more different. Wanchese grew to despise the English as he came to know them better. Manteo, on the other hand, became completely fascinated by them. When the expedition returned to England in late September, Sir Walter Raleigh, the man responsible for the entire mission, immediately began preparing a new expedition this time, not just to explore, but to establish a permanent settlement in the Outer Banks. Queen Elizabeth I even granted Raleigh a knighthood, a tremendous honor at the time. In April 1585, 7 ships carrying nearly 600 men departed England, bound for America. The ships were loaded with enough supplies to sustain those men for an entire year. By late June, the fleet reached the Outer Banks, but they were met with a serious problem. Navigation in the area was extremely difficult, a fact made painfully clear by the wrecked ships scattered everywhere. As the flagship entered the shallow waters, its hull was badly damaged from below. And as you know, large ships require deep water to survive. But that wasn't the real disaster. The flagship was carrying most of the supplies. When it was damaged, huge quantities of food and equipment were lost to the sea, which meant one thing: there was no longer enough food for 600 people. The colonists were forced to drastically reduce the size of the settlement. In the end, they decided to leave behind only 100 men. With the approval of the native tribes, construction of the colony began. The main reason they chose this island in particular was its strategic location. The island itself lay very close to the open waters, allowing ships to enter and leave with relative ease. At the same time, it was well hidden from the Spanish, and at that moment in history, that mattered more than anything. England and Spain were at war, and the Spanish already controlled large territories throughout the region. If the Spanish fleet caught even a hint that the English were attempting to build a colony, they would destroy any hope England had of settling America. The plan was simple. Before winter ended, new supplies and reinforcements were expected to arrive at the colony. But the settlers had no idea that back in England, Queen Elizabeth I had canceled the mission, overwhelmed by political and military crises at home. So when the supplies ran out, the colonists were forced to rely heavily on the native tribes. The English still didn't understand the land. They didn't understand the seasons, and surviving without the supplies that were supposed to arrive was nearly impossible. The native people, however, lived hand to mouth. They had barely enough for themselves, and they simply couldn't meet the colonists' ever-growing demands. Slowly, the relationship began to crack. Around this time, something disturbing started to happen. Whenever the English visited a native village, people began dying suddenly and in large numbers. The native tribes came to believe the English possessed some kind of hidden weapon in visible projectiles that could kill from a distance. The truth was far worse. The English themselves didn't understand it yet. Science hadn't advanced that far, but they were carrying deadly diseases they were immune to. The native people were not. A devastating epidemic swept through the tribes, killing countless people. As fear and suspicion grew, Ralph Lane, the governor of the colony, and Wingana, the local tribal leader, began to distrust one another. Conditions deteriorated rapidly until living side by side became impossible. Eventually, Wingana made a decision. He took his people and retreated deep into the mainland, settling in a distant village, leaving Roanoke Island entirely to the colonists. But given everything that had happened, and shaped by a deeply aggressive European mindset, Ralph Lane became convinced that Wingana hadn't retreated in peace. Lane believed Wingana had gone to unite multiple tribes and return with an army to wipe out the colony. In his own words, Lane chose to strike first before they could strike him. On June 1st, 1586, Ralph Lane and his men marched into the mainland. They slaughtered the villagers they found there. Wingana was among the dead. His head was severed and displayed outside the colony as a warning. Just 1 week after this massacre, an English fleet commanded by Sir Francis Drake passed by the Outer Banks on its return voyage to England. Drake stopped briefly not to settle, but simply to check on the colony and see whether they needed help. What he found was a disaster. With the supplies gone, the land exhausted, and the damage already done, the settlers realized the colony was no longer sustainable. They decided to abandon it entirely. The evacuation was rushed. Everyone boarded the ships except for 3 men. Those 3 were not present at the time of departure. The fleet sailed without them, and no one has ever known what became of them. Although the 1584 expedition had been a remarkable success, the 1585 colony was a failure by every possible measure. Relations with the native tribes had completely collapsed after the massacre, and the colonists had spent much of their time chasing rumors of gold and copper believed to exist in the region. They found nothing. From every angle, the mission was a catastrophic failure, and yet there was one man who still believed in returning. His name was John White. White was an artist and cartographer. Almost every image and map we have of these events today comes either from his original drawings or later works based directly on them. Along with a small group of supporters, White spent months trying to convince Sir Walter Raleigh to attempt the colony one more time, but this time, everything would be different. This would not be a military outpost. It would be a true settlement. Men, women, children. Among them was Eleanor Dare, John White's daughter, who was pregnant at the time. This time, the colony would not return to Roanoke. The disasters there had made it clear the island was no longer suitable. Instead, they chose a new destination, the Chesapeake Bay. It was a better location for several reasons. The waters were deeper, allowing large ships to approach safely, unlike the dangerous shallows of Roanoke. The sea was calmer, the land was vast, and the soil far more fertile. Eventually, they succeeded in convincing Sir Walter Raleigh to fund one last attempt. Once the financing was secured, a fleet of 3 ships under the command of John White set sail for America to begin a new colony. John White was appointed governor of the new colony. The first settlement had been so disastrously unlucky that just days after the evacuation, a supply ship sent by Sir Walter Raleigh finally arrived. The crew landed on the island and searched for the colonists, but found no one, not even the 3 men who had been left behind. So they returned to their ship, took the supplies back aboard, and sailed back to England. In other words, if the settlers had waited just 1 more week, the supply ship would have arrived. And the irony didn't end there. 2 weeks later, another English fleet, also loaded with supplies, passed by the colony on its way back to England. They stopped to check if the settlement needed anything. Once again, they found no one. The fleet's commander refused to leave the colony completely abandoned, so he left 15 men behind, ordering them to remain at Roanoke until further notice. Then the fleet sailed on to England. John White knew all of this before he ever left England. Because of that, he planned to stop at Roanoke on his way to Chesapeake Bay to check on the 15 men and possibly bring them with him. But when White's expedition reached the region, something unexpected happened. The expedition's Portuguese pilot, Simão Fernandes, had other plans. Fernandes was known to be unpredictable, and everyone aboard treated him accordingly. So when he suddenly ignored his orders and announced that they would not sail to Chesapeake Bay, no one was able to stop him, not even White himself. Fernandes forced the settlers to disembark at Roanoke. When they reached the old settlement, they found it abandoned once again. The 15 men left by Drake were gone. All that remained was a pile of bones, what appeared to be the remains of one of them. White immediately assumed the worst, that the native tribes had attacked and killed the 15 men, taking revenge for what the earlier colonists had done. A few days later, suspicion turned into certainty. A group of native warriors attacked a colonist named George Howe, killing him in a brutal ambush. The message was clear. The English were no longer welcome here, but the settlers were not completely alone. They still had an ally, Montejo, the Native American who had once traveled to England with the first expedition. The tribes trusted him, they respected him, and now Montejo served as the colony's intermediary and ambassador. Montejo was now responsible for managing relations with the native tribes. He served as the mediator in every negotiation and agreement. After the death of George Howe, John White and Montejo traveled to Croatoan Island to speak directly with the native people and learn what had happened. There, they received confirmation of their fears. A group of native warriors had indeed attacked the 15 men left at the colony, killing at least 2 of them. The leader of the attack was Juan Chesse, the same man who had once traveled to England with the English, only to return harboring deep hatred toward them. After 2 of the 15 were killed, the remaining 13 took a small boat and fled the island. From that moment on, no one ever heard from them again. By then, one truth was clear to John White. Roanoke had become a dangerous place to live. At the time, Simão Fernandes was still anchored with the ships in the Outer Banks. He insisted on staying in the area for a month in case of emergencies, and he was right. The settlers were deeply worried about their future. They needed more people to defend themselves if the native tribes attacked again, and they needed far more supplies than originally planned to prepare for any crisis. So the colonists asked their governor, John White, to return to England with Simão Fernandes to secure reinforcements and provisions. White hesitated. He feared that returning to England would make it look like he had abandoned his responsibility, and more than that, he would be leaving behind his daughter and his grandchild on the island. Taking them with him would look suspicious. Leaving them behind felt dangerous. But after persistent pressure from the settlers, John White finally agreed. He sailed back to England with Fernandes, not knowing that this would be the last time he would ever see them. After a long and exhausting journey, White arrived in England on the brink of war with Spain. The plan was simple: stay for a few days, gather supplies and manpower, then return immediately to the colony. But a catastrophe intervened, one that would change White's life forever. Queen Elizabeth I issued an order. No ship was to leave England until the war with Spain was over. The Atlantic was closed. Every ship was needed for England's defense in case Spain launched an invasion. And despite repeated attempts, John White was trapped in England for 3 long years, cut off from the colony and from his daughter. In the spring of 1590, with the help of Sir Walter Raleigh, White finally managed to begin his return voyage. When the expedition reached the Outer Banks in mid-August, they fired their cannons to announce their arrival signals meant to tell the colonists that help had come, that the supplies they desperately needed were finally here. But no one answered. Not a single gunshot, not a single sign of life. Alarmed, they sent 2 small boats ahead to investigate. When they reached the shore, there was no one there. They searched along the path toward the settlement, still nothing. The first strange discovery was a tree, carved with 3 letters, CRO. Deeper inside the settlement, they found another carving, this time on a wooden post that had once formed part of the colony's defensive fence. It read, CROATOAN. The colony was completely abandoned, and it was clear that it had been abandoned for a long time. Tall grass and thick vegetation covered the area, untouched for months, maybe years. The houses were broken and empty. There were no supplies, no boats, no sign of fresh water, nothing. The entire mystery of the lost colony of Roanoke revolves around those 2 carvings, CROATOAN. Most retellings surround these words with an aura of deep mystery. But for John White, there was nothing mysterious about them at all. Before leaving the colony in 1587 to seek supplies, White had made an agreement with the settlers. If they were ever forced to leave the settlement and move elsewhere, they were to carve the name of their destination somewhere visible. But if they left under threat or danger, they were also to carve the symbol of a cross. There was no cross beside the word CROATOAN. That meant only one thing. The colonists had gone there by choice. Convinced of this, White returned to the ship's captain and urged him to sail to CROATOAN Island to find the settlers. The captain agreed, but just as they were preparing to depart, disaster struck again. The ship's anchor cable snapped. Without an anchor, the captain feared navigating shallow waters, risking the ship entirely. He refused to continue. No matter how much White pleaded, the captain would not change his mind. White had no authority over him, and so, helpless, John White was forced to return to England. It was the last time he would ever cross the Atlantic. At first glance, the story seems simple. The Roanoke colonists left their settlement and moved to Croatoan Island. Case closed. And yet John White's own notes suggest something far more complicated. In his journals, White wrote that before leaving in 1587, the colonists had been preparing to move 50 miles inland, deep into the mainland. While Croatoan lies roughly that same distance from Roanoke, It is not inland at all, it is another island, which raises a disturbing possibility. What if Croatoan was not their final destination? If so, where did they go next? More than 20 years after the colonists vanished, the war between England and Spain finally came to an end, and with it, Europe's obsession with colonizing the Americas was reborn. In 1607, the settlement of Jamestown was established within lands controlled by a group of native tribes under the leadership of a man named Powhatan. On one occasion, Powhatan managed to capture John Smith, the leader of the colony. During his captivity, Powhatan spoke of a place inhabited by people who dressed like Europeans. After John Smith was released in 1608, he created a map of this mysterious location, but like many claims from that era, its truth remains uncertain. Historians still debate whether it was rumor or fact. Other reports claim that Powhatan killed most of the settlers, leaving only a few survivors who scattered throughout the region, their fates unknown. Yet another account describes a group of native people with pale skin and light hair, which led some to speculate that they might be descendants of the original Roanoke settlers. A century later, English explorer John Lawson traveled to the area and made contact with the Hatteras tribe descendants of the people living on what had once been Croatoan. Some members of the tribe told Lawson that one of their ancestors had fair skin and could see things others could not. This convinced Lawson that the Hatteras were likely descendants of the lost colony, suggesting that the settlers had integrated with the native tribes, marrying and blending into a new community. Exploration on the topic then ceased for over 200 years. In the 1930s, interest in the lost colony resurfaced after the discovery of inscribed stones. Researchers suggested that these stones were written by Eleanor Dare, John White's daughter. Though many argued the stones were forgeries, the first stone has never been proven fake. It contains a message from Eleanor to her father, recounting the tragedies that befell the colony and the death of her husband and child. Strangely, the man who discovered these stones vanished from historical records, and the location of the discovery remains secret. Excavations in the Hatteras area have unearthed both native and European artifacts, supporting Lawson's accounts, but still, no conclusive evidence links the site directly to the lost colony. Many clues have since been lost, submerged by rising waters and erosion over the centuries. As of 2011, the stones remain the most recent discovery connected to Roanoke. When researchers examined John White's map, they made another surprising discovery. Historically, cartographers corrected mistakes by pasting small overlays on their maps and redrawing sections. Upon inspecting White's map, scholars found that beneath one overlay was the drawing of a four-pointed star, a symbol of forts or settlements from that era, drawn with the same ink as the rest of the map. This confirmed that White himself had drawn it, rather than it being added later. The star is located roughly 50 miles west of Roanoke, close to areas described in White's records. Excavations there also uncovered European pottery and metal artifacts, but as with Hatteras, no definitive connection has been established to the lost colony. To this day, the fate of the lost colony remains a mystery. Some believe the settlers simply moved to Chesapeake Bay and integrated peacefully into local communities. Others speculate they attempted to return to England, but were lost at sea. Unanswered questions remain. What happened to the 3 men left behind during the first evacuation? What became of the settlers who fled in the small boat? Why did Simão Fernandes ignore orders and leave the colony at Roanoke instead of sailing to Chesapeake Bay? If answers exist, they are buried somewhere in the region, waiting to be discovered. And so ends the story of the lost colony of Roanoke. If you enjoyed this tale, leave your thoughts in the comments. If you have suggestions or stories you'd like us to explore, share them. We might cover the most popular ones in future videos. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe, and pass this channel along to anyone who would enjoy these stories. We'll see you next time, with an even more thrilling story than before. The mystery of Roanoke lives on.